Hi guys. So today we're going to talk about this Eastern Front here. We're going to talk about something called the Gallipoli Campaign, which happened right in this area, also kind of known as the Dardanelles Campaign. So this Gallipoli or the Dardanelles Campaign here. And we're also going to talk about the end of the war. So first of all, I'm going to describe on the map what the Gallipoli Campaign was all about, and then you'll write a little bit. So first of all, Russia's here, obviously, and you got France and Great Britain over here. And as Germany, Austria-Hungary, and this Ottoman Empire kind of connected together, Russia was fearful. This is before Russia dropped out of the war. So this is 1914, 1915, right at the beginning of the war. Russia is fearful that they're going to have their supply lines with their buddies cut off. And so they decide to, the Tsar Nicholas of Russia goes to Great Britain and says, hey, I'd really like, you guys to help me out here. I think this campaign along this area right here would be a good idea because we can open up supply routes. And also maybe if we cut the connection between, if we cut this connection in right here, if we end up in control of this strait, this area around the Black Sea, this strait of the Dardanelles right in here, and this connection to the Mediterranean Sea, then maybe the Ottoman Empire is cut away from their buddies and maybe we eliminate them from the war effort. So that's kind of the thought process. Far more complicated, of course, than that. So away we go. Let's talk about that. Okay, so first of all, the Gallipoli Campaign was an attack at the Dardanelles. Now, the Dardanelles is very close to Constantinople, which is the capital city of the Ottoman Empire, and eventually that's where Turkey is located. Well, it's where Turkey is located in modern day. But this attack along the Dardanelles is really about controlling a waterway that is going to keep supplies flowing between France, Great Britain, and Russia. It's actually kind of an all-encompassing campaign. So in February of 1915, which is fairly early in the war, the British, the Australians, New Zealand, and France do this combination attack. It's actually one of the first amphibious landings in history, which is kind of interesting all by itself. Before the video starts playing, I will tell you ahead of time, spoiler alert, the Allies don't do very well here. The British think that they can get away with using kind of old-scaled, old junky equipment, and because their best equipment is being used along the Eastern Front and the Western Front, and they try to get away with using junky stuff. They think that this part of the world isn't going to be as well defended, and it ends up biting them in the rear. So watch this video and learn a little bit more about this Gallipoli campaign.
The Gallipoli Campaign, 1915 to 1916. By the year 1915, the war on the Western Front had slowed to a stalemate. The Allied powers fighting in Belgium and France were considering opening a new front. Grand Duke Nicholas of Russia had appealed to Britain for assistance against the Ottoman Empire, who were on the side of the Central Powers and had invaded the Caucasus. A naval expedition was launched by the Allies to capture the Dardanelles Straits, a passage that connected the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara in northwestern Turkey. If they were successful in their goal, the Allies could link up supply routes with Russia and knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war. Furthermore, as First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill proposed, opening another front would dilute the German army further as they supported the depleting Ottoman Turkish army. Winston Churchill pushed for a naval attack on the Dardanelles with a bombardment by British and French battleships on February 19, 1915. The Turks had placed mines in the water, and the minesweepers had failed to detect many of them. On March 18th, Allied battleships entered the straits. Fire from the Turks and undetected mines sank 3 of the ships and damaged 3 others. After this failed naval attack, an amphibious beach attack would begin on the Gallipoli Peninsula. General Ian Hamilton was commander. Under his command were British forces, ANZAC, standing for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and lastly, French troops. The landing started on April 25th. The Allies suffered heavy casualties establishing the beachheads Cape Helles and Gaba Tepe on the Aegean coast. Gaba Tepe became known as Anzac Cove in honor of the Australian and New Zealand troops who fought valiantly against the determined Ottoman Turkish defenders. After the landing, the Allies could not progress as trench warfare quickly formed like on the Western Front. The summer heat and dysentery epidemic were unbearable. Swarms of flies hung around corpses. Hamilton ordered an attack on Suvla Bay in August, involving the landing of 63,000 Allied troops. They were to link up with the Anzacs at Anzac Cove and break the stalemate, but indecision meant that the Ottoman army could reinforce, and by August 10th, an attack led by Mustafa Kemal recaptured Suvla Bay. Allied casualties increased, and the stalemate continued. Reinforcements were lacking. It was time for evacuation. The order to evacuate the Allied troops was given on the 7th of December, with the last troops leaving Suvla Bay and Anzac Cove before dawn on the 20th of December 1915. The evacuation was a success with not one casualty. The last troops left Hellas on January 9th, 1916. The Gallipoli campaign was a disaster for the Allies. They suffered more than 250,000 casualties and losses. Gallipoli has become a defining moment in the history of both Australia and New Zealand. The battle is also seen as a significant event, aiding in the foundation of modern Turkey. Subscribe to see more history videos, and get Simple History World War I out today.
Okay, so the Gallipoli campaign was an attempt to kind of cut the Central Powers and weaken them, but ended up being the Allied powers bit off more than they could chew, and they suffer a pretty humiliating defeat there and have to pull back. Now, fortunately for the Allied powers, the Ottoman Empire is still going to crumble, and that's going to leave the Allies in decent shape. Okay, now we haven't talked much about that Eastern Front. Remember, the Schlieffen Plan had placed some kind of fortifications along Russia, thinking they were going to be slow to mobilize, and indeed they were, but not necessarily just because of their size and because of their lack of kind of industrialization. That's part of it, but part of it also had to do with the Russian Revolution. It didn't just happen in 1917. Since 1905, there have been skirmishes inside of Russia and people that have been fighting for control. And so even though we just recently talked about a major revolution in Russia, there had been conflict and kind of disturbances going on there for a long time. Now, some of the things that worked out along the Eastern Front, Russia was successful at first, at least at holding some of the German troops there along those lines. Supplies were short for both sides along that Eastern Front. It was cold, which made it really difficult to deal with. When winter set in at various times, a couple winters before Russia pulled out, it was really difficult for either to survive, and sometimes they were just kind of holing up and not much fighting was going on. So it did effectively tie Germany up for a period of time and held some of the troops off that could have been fighting along the Western Front. So in that sense, the Eastern Front was maybe a moderate success. However, there were battles that got fought that fairly decisively went in Germany's favor. So listen to this. In contrast to the Western Front, the war on the Eastern Front was marked by more mobility. The cost in lives, however, was equally enormous. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army moved into Eastern Germany, but was fairly decisively defeated at two places, the Battle of Tannenberg on August 30th and the Battle of Masurian Lakes in September. As a result of these defeats, the Russians were no longer a real threat to German territory, but that didn't mean that that Germany was able to just kind of walk away from that Eastern Front. Now, the good things about that was that it held some of the German forces off. The downside is, of course, that Russia pulls out. By 1917, they're fully involved in their own kind of revolution and civil war. And as a result, they'll pull off. And at that point, Germany is going to be allowed to shift their armies into other directions. And at this point, they're going to make a final push along the Western Front. Fortunately, this timing is right in that the United States is getting involved just as Russia is pulling out. We'll take a look at this in just a second, but first of all, take a look at that bottom left. This guy's name is Alvin York. And the other day we were talking about selective service and how in the United States we were forcing men to sign up for, to be registered for the draft. Alvin York is one of the first examples of somebody who, he's a born-again Christian. He is from Tennessee. Long story short, he and his buddies, when they were growing up as teenagers, he was in trouble a lot. And he and his buddy, 16, 17 years old or so, they're out drinking one night. There's a bar fight and one of his buddies gets killed. And supposedly he kind of has this awakening at that point and turns to God. Ultimately, though, when World War I rolls around, he is a very religious man and doesn't feel like he can, that it's going to be going against his conscience to go ahead and fight in World War I. So he becomes kind of this quintessential conscientious objector. This first time that somebody challenges the government saying that legally they don't think that they can fight or can be asked to fight, that it's a moral, that moral law for them outweighs the political law, the government's laws of the country. He actually is not allowed to not be part of the war effort. He is told that it's his legal responsibility. He has to go, but he'll be allowed to be a medic. Things happen, though, during World War I that he is forced to take the lives of and capture German soldiers. He ends up really celebrated. He gets promoted to sergeant, and it's kind of an interesting story. But it brings up that idea of, how does somebody force you to be part of the war effort if morally it's against your moral code. All right, so let's take a look at the end here. The collapse of Germany happens around November 3rd of 1918. Austria-Hungary had just surrendered to the Allies, and Germany is going to be left alone. Now, in part because Germany's been cut off from the supplies that it needed due to the British blockade, the people inside of Germany are really suffering. And it actually comes down to that. So German sailors start to mutiny against government authority, and the mutiny starts to spread. And then throughout Germany, groups of soldiers and workers start to organize revolutionary councils and start to rise up against the government and just say they won't do it anymore. They're going to establish, kind of from the inside out, they're going to establish a German republic. The Kaiser is going to be forced to give up the throne. He is going to be forced out of the country. If you remember from your homework, he ends up being forced to flee to Holland, where he lives out the next 23 years of his life. Although there were no Allied soldiers on German territory and no truly decisive battle had been fought, the Germans were just too exhausted to continue fighting. They were out of supplies. So at the 11th hour, on the 11th day in the 11th month of 1918, which is Veterans Day, of course, Germany agreed to a ceasefire along the armistice or truce that ended the war. And so really it's a matter of those supply lines being cut off and the people inside not being able to replenish what they had been using up. So while they weren't thoroughly defeated, they were demoralized. And as a result, and left alone and surrounded, and I think that felt like this was their best option. And so World War I ends. The final toll is a horrible one. World War I was one of the bloodiest wars in history. It was the bloodiest up to that time. Now, World War II will eventually surpass it. The deaths numbered 22 million, more than half of them civilian. Now, these are really low numbers in this textbook. I've seen as high as 40 million deaths. In addition, 20 million people wounded, 10 million refugees. The direct economic cost of the war might have been as high as $338 billion. The United States, just to kind of put things in perspective,